Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a world without hotel bookings, without roadside motels, and without the comforting certainty that there would be a clean pillow waiting at the end of the day. So dim the lights a little, let your shoulders drop, and let your mind wander back to a time when travel was slow, uncomfortable, and more often than not deeply inconvenient. If you enjoy these long, boring walks through the quieter corners of history, you can gently tap the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and then do absolutely nothing else. The story will keep going whether you're awake or not. Now, let's begin. When we imagine medieval journeys, we usually picture kings on horseback, entourages trailing behind them, banners fluttering, and some unfortunate court poet trying to stay awake. But most people on medieval roads were not kings. They were not nobles. They were not even merchants with decent shoes. They were peasants, poor ones, and when poor peasants traveled, the question of where they stayed was less a matter of comfort and more a matter of basic survival. For most medieval peasants, travel itself was already unusual. Life was small. Villages were tight circles of fields, mud, animals, and familiar faces. Many people lived and died within a few miles of where they were born, not because they loved it, but because leaving was expensive, dangerous, and often pointless. Still, sometimes travel happened. A pilgrimage, a seasonal labor job, a court summons, a famine, a war that came too close to home, or simply the quiet realization that there was nothing left to eat where you were standing. When a peasant stepped onto a road, they did not pack much. A bundle of bread, maybe cheese if times were good, a cloak that doubled as bedding, and an understanding usually learned early that the night would not be gentle. There were no inns meant for them, at least, not in the way we think of inns. Medieval inns did exist, but they were businesses, and businesses expected payment. Even the cheapest taverns clustered near towns charged money, food, or labor. A truly poor peasant often had none to spare, and so, the road itself became part of their lodging strategy. The most common place a poor traveler slept was simply wherever they stopped walking. Fields were popular, not because they were comfortable, but because they were open. A hedgerow offered some shelter from wind. A ditch could block the worst of the night air. Cloaks were spread on the ground. Sometimes straw was stolen from barns, if one could do so quietly. Sleep came lightly. The medieval countryside was not silent. Animals moved at night, so did thieves, and sometimes wolves, though not as often as later stories would insist. Still, fear was a constant companion, curled up just beside the traveler, breathing quietly. Churches were another option, not always welcoming, not always open, but often tolerated. Many rural churches left their doors unlocked, partly out of piety and partly because there was nothing inside worth stealing. A traveler might sleep in the porch, the narthex, or pressed against the outer wall. Inside, if allowed, the stone floor was cold, but it was sacred cold. That mattered. The church did not promise warmth, it promised safety of a different kind. Violence was less likely. Theft was frowned upon, and if someone died in the night, which did happen at least, they were already close to a priest. Monasteries, when encountered, offered better odds, not comfort, just odds. Monks were obligated to hospitality, at least in theory, but that hospitality had limits, especially for the poor. Wealthy pilgrims received beds, important guests received food. Poor travelers might receive a bowl of soup, a crust of bread, and permission to sleep in an outbuilding or stable. It was not kindness, it was duty, and duty, in medieval Europe, was often delivered with a sigh. Then there were private homes. This was the most uncertain option of all. Village customs sometimes allowed travelers to request shelter for a night, but accepting a stranger carried risk. Disease, theft, trouble with local authorities. So peasants learned how to ask, carefully, humbly, briefly, usually at dusk, when refusal felt cruel but acceptance still felt dangerous. If allowed inside, the guests slept on the floor, near the hearth, if lucky. More often near the animals. The warmth helped. The smell lingered. In return, the traveler might offer labor, a bit of field work, chopping wood, carrying water. Even a few hours of help could earn a meal and a corner to collapse into. But refusal was common, and refusals piled up as daylight faded, which brings us back to the road. Roadside shelters did exist, though they were rare and unreliable. Some were little more than roofed platforms. Others were abandoned buildings, ruins from Roman times, slowly collapsing into medieval usefulness. Everyone knew where they were. Everyone hoped they were empty, and sometimes they weren't. Travelers shared space with strangers. Strangers shared lice. Lice shared everything. Privacy did not exist. Comfort did not enter the conversation. For women, the risks were sharper. A lone female traveler faced dangers that were widely understood and rarely discussed. Many women traveled only in groups, or attached themselves to pilgrim caravans, even if they did not believe in the pilgrimage itself. Children, when traveling, learned quickly how to sleep through hunger, how to curl up small, how to stay quiet. And all of this, every ditch, porch, stable, and borrowed corner was considered normal. This was not hardship in the medieval mind. This was travel. The idea that a journey should include comfort was reserved for the wealthy. And even then, comfort was relative. As the night deepened, peasants did not dream of featherbeds. They dreamed of sunrise, of movement, of putting distance behind them before something found them in the dark. And when morning came, stiff and cold, they stood up, shook the dirt from their cloaks, and walked again, because the road did not care who you were, and it certainly did not provide accommodation. Let's drift forward slowly, because the next step in this story isn't about where peasants slept, but where they were allowed to sleep and who decided that for them. By the second day on the road, most poor travelers had already learned an important lesson. Sleep was not just about finding a place, it was about finding permission. In medieval society, permission mattered more than comfort. Who could stop, who could stay, who could rest without being questioned? And poor peasants, unfortunately, ranked very low on that list. As villages became more tightly controlled in the later Middle Ages, strangers were no longer simply tired people passing through. They were risks. They were mouths to feed. They were possible criminals, possible carriers of disease, possible problems someone else would have to clean up. So when a peasant approached a village at dusk, they did not stroll in confidently. They hovered, they slowed, they watched for cinder smoke from chimneys, animals being brought in, doors being shut. Because once the doors were shut, the village had made its decision. In many places, villagers were allowed, sometimes encouraged, to turn strangers away. This was not cruelty, it was self-preservation. Food was limited, space was limited, and law enforcement, such as it was, tended to punish communities collectively if something went wrong. If a theft occurred, the village answered for it. If violence broke out, the village explained itself. So refusing a traveler was safer than helping one. This meant that poor peasants often slept just outside villages, not far enough to be invisible, not close enough to be welcome, a kind of social twilight zone where one existed but did not belong. Ditches near village boundaries were common sleeping spots, so were tree lines just beyond cultivated fields. These places offered minimal shelter and maximal deniability. If something happened in the night, the village could honestly say the traveler was never inside, and if nothing happened, well, then no one talked about it. Town gates were worse. Towns were guarded spaces, even small ones. Gates closed at night, sometimes early, sometimes abruptly. If you arrived too late, you stayed outside. No exceptions, not for hunger, not for rain, and certainly not for peasants without money. Sleeping outside town walls was dangerous. Thieves knew it, watchmen knew it, dogs knew it. Some towns allowed travelers to sleep near gatehouses or under walls, but this was tolerated, not sanctioned. You could be chased off at any moment, or fined in the morning for loitering, if someone felt particularly motivated. Still, people stayed, because there was nowhere else to go. Guildhalls and fraternities occasionally provided shelter, but only to their own members. A traveling craftsman with the right connections might find a floor and a meal. A peasant without a guild, without papers, without proof of belonging, would not. Belonging mattered more than need. Documents were rare among peasants, but reputation traveled slowly. If you came from nowhere recognizable, you were nowhere yourself. Some travelers learned to name familiar villages, whether they had been there or not, simply to sound real, and sometimes it worked. Hospitals, meaning medieval hospices, not medical centers, offered another possibility. These institutions were meant for pilgrims, the sick, and the poor, but their resources were thin, beds were few, rules were strict. You might be allowed to stay one night, two, if you were visibly ill. After that, you were moved along, not healed, just moved. Many hospices separated men and women. Some separated locals and foreigners. Some admitted only pilgrims with visible badges, which encouraged a thriving trade in fake pilgrim tokens. Again, this was not generosity, it was management. The medieval world managed poverty by keeping it moving, and so peasants moved. At night, sleeping arrangements followed an unspoken hierarchy. Children closest to adults, women closer to walls, men on the outside. Fires, if any, small and controlled. Smoke was dangerous. Light attracted attention. Conversation faded quickly. Exhaustion did the rest. It's important to understand that medieval people did not romanticize this. They did not think of it as character building or spiritually enriching. They thought of it as cold, unpleasant, and unavoidable. Chronic fatigue was normal. Aches were constant. Illness followed travelers closely, picking up opportunities wherever sleep was shallow and bodies were weak. And yet, the system persisted, because the system worked just well enough for those who designed it. Laws against vagrancy grew stronger over time. Being poor and mobile became suspicious. In some regions, travelers were required to prove employment or destination. Failure to do so could lead to arrest, forced labor, or expulsion. Ironically, this made travel even harder for the poor who often traveled because they were unemployed. It was a loop with no exit. Some peasants adapted by attaching themselves to larger movements, pilgrimages, seasonal migrations, military campaigns, even plague evacuations. Safety came in numbers, and numbers blurred individual identity. If you were one of many, you were less likely to be questioned. If you were alone, you were noticeable. By now, you might be wondering whether peasants ever found something resembling comfort on the road. Something planned, something reliable. Occasionally, yes, but those places were not meant for them. And as we drift onward, we'll look at how inns, taverns, and hostels existed alongside peasant travelers, often just out of reach, sometimes hostile, and always reminding the poor exactly where they stood in medieval society. For now, just let that image settle. A figure lying just beyond the village boundary. Not invited, not chased away, simply allowed to exist until morning. By the third stretch of a journey, the road itself began to feel familiar. Not friendly, just familiar. Feet moved automatically. Shoulders stayed low. Eyes learned where to look, and more importantly, where not to. And somewhere along the way, every poor peasant traveler noticed the same thing. There were places to stay. They just weren't meant for people like them. Inns existed across medieval Europe long before they became romanticized in stories. But these were not welcoming havens with roaring fires and smiling hosts. They were businesses, practical and suspicious by nature. Their job was not kindness. Their job was to make money and avoid trouble. And poor peasants were very often considered trouble. Most inns were located along major roads, near towns, markets, or river crossings. They catered primarily to merchants, officials, messengers, and pilgrims with means. A traveler who arrived without coins was not a customer. They were a question mark. Could they pay later? Would they steal? Would they get sick and die on the floor? Innkeepers were not eager to find out. So when a peasant approached an inn, the interaction was brief. A glance, a pause, a question about payment. And if the answer was unclear, the door stayed closed. Even when allowed inside, the experience was limited. The cheapest inns offered no private rooms. Travelers slept together on straw pallets in common halls. Beds were shared, sometimes by strangers, sometimes by necessity. The idea of personal space had not yet entered the medieval imagination. But even this required payment. Food cost extra. Firelight cost extra. Stables cost extra. Everything had a price, and peasants often had nothing left by the time night fell. Taverns were worse. Unlike inns, taverns existed primarily to sell drink, ale, mostly, weak by modern standards, but constant. Taverns were loud, social spaces. They were not designed for sleeping, and they were not designed for the poor to linger. A peasant might spend their last coin on a drink, not because they wanted alcohol, but because warmth and light came with it. Sitting near the hearth for an hour was sometimes worth the price of hunger the next day. But once the drink was gone, so was the welcome. Many taverns actively discouraged sleeping. Bodies on the floor took up space. They scared away better customers, and they attracted attention from local authorities. So peasants drank, warmed their hands, listened quietly, and left again back into the dark. There were hostels too, often attached to religious institutions. These were closer to what we might consider charitable lodging. But even here, hierarchy ruled. Pilgrims with official badges were prioritized. Men and women were separated. Rules were enforced. Lights out early. Wake up early. Move on quickly. The poor were not invited to rest. They were invited to pass through. And then there were the places peasants were warned not to stay. Abandoned buildings, old barns, ruins left over from Roman occupation or earlier wars. These structures offered walls and roofs, but also danger. Collapsing stone, squatters, criminals hiding from law or debt. Still, people slept there, because sometimes a broken wall was better than open ground. Fires were risky indoors. Smoke choked small spaces, but without fire, cold crept in. Damp settled into bones. Illness followed. Many peasants carried flint and tinder, not for comfort, but for survival. A small flame could dry clothes, cook scraps, and keep animals at bay, but it also made you visible. Visibility was not always good. Roadside crime was real, but it was also exaggerated by those who never traveled. Most thefts were small: food, shoes, cloaks. But for someone with nothing, losing even a single item could end a journey entirely. So peasants learned to sleep lightly, one ear open, hands near possessions, bodies curled protectively around whatever they owned. Dogs helped. Some travelers kept them, not as companions, but as alarms. A dog, growling softly in the dark, was often enough to send trouble elsewhere. Women traveling alone developed different strategies. Some disguised themselves as men. Some joined temporary groups. Some avoided inns altogether, preferring open spaces where they could see threats coming. None of these options were safe. They were simply less unsafe. Children learned quickly not to cry at night. Sound carried. Attention followed sound. A quiet child survived better than a loud one. And all the while, the more comfortable options remained visible but inaccessible. A peasant could see light spilling from an inn window, hear laughter, smell meat roasting. These were not fantasies. They were real. They were just not for everyone. This proximity made the inequality sharper. Medieval society did not hide its divisions. It displayed them openly. Comfort was a signal of status, and denying comfort reinforced that status. If you were poor, you were expected to endure, quietly. What's striking is how rarely the system was questioned, not because peasants thought it was fair, but because it was normal. The road did not owe you anything, neither did the people along it. Travel was a privilege disguised as necessity. By the later Middle Ages, some regions attempted regulation, standard prices for inside rules against overcharging, obligations to admit travelers, but enforcement was inconsistent, and loopholes were plentiful. An innkeeper could always claim they were full, or unsafe, or unwilling, and so peasants continued to sleep where they could, under carts, against walls, beside fields that were not theirs. The journey itself became a test of endurance, not distance. Every night survived was a small success. Every morning reached was proof that the road had not won. As we move further along, we'll drift into the long-term effects of this kind of travel, what it did to bodies, to health, to how medieval people understood rest, privacy, and exhaustion. Because when sleep is never guaranteed, it changes the way you live even when the journey finally ends. For now, let the road stretch out behind us and ahead of us, quiet, unforgiving, and never designed for those who walked it the hardest. By the fourth part of this quiet journey, it becomes clear that medieval travel was not just inconvenient, it was formative. The road shaped bodies, it reshaped expectations, and it quietly redefined what rest even meant for poor peasants. Because when sleep is uncertain every night, the body learns to accept less of it. Medieval peasants did not think of sleep as a right. It was not something you planned for or demanded. Sleep happened when conditions allowed it, and when it didn't, you continued anyway. This produced a kind of constant exhaustion that most people simply carried with them. Chronic fatigue was normal. Stiff joints were normal. Waking up sore was not a sign that something was wrong. It was proof that you were alive. On the road, this exhaustion intensified. Sleeping on the ground compressed muscles that were already overworked. Dampness crept into bones. Cold settled into joints. Many travelers woke, unable to straighten their backs fully for hours, but they walked anyway. Medical understanding at the time offered little comfort. Pain was often interpreted as imbalance, punishment, or inevitability. Treatments were limited. Advice was vague. Rest was recommended to those who could afford it. Poor travelers could not. Foot injuries were common. Blisters turned into infections. Minor cuts festered. Shoes, if owned at all, were worn thin. Many peasants walked barefoot for at least part of their journey, not as an act of devotion, but because leather was expensive. Cold nights slowed healing. Dirt made everything worse. And yet, stopping entirely was often more dangerous than continuing. A stationary peasant was suspicious. A moving peasant was simply passing through. Sleep deprivation affected the mind as well. Medieval travelers experienced something we would now recognize as cognitive fatigue. Slower reactions, confusion, poor judgment. On lonely roads, this made people vulnerable. Wrong turns were taken, bad decisions made, trust misplaced. Hallucinations were not unheard of, especially after days of poor sleep and limited food. Shadows moved, sounds lingered, people sensed presences that were not there. These experiences fed into medieval beliefs about spirits, demons, and divine signs. When you were exhausted, the world feels closer to the edge. Night itself became an enemy. Darkness was not just the absence of light, it was a condition, a time when normal rules loosened, when danger felt nearer, when prayers were spoken more often, not because people were especially pious, but because there was nothing else to do. Travelers prayed before sleeping, not ceremonially, practically, a brief mutter, a sign of the cross, a habit repeated so often it became automatic. Morning prayers were quieter, relief-based. Surviving the night mattered more than sleeping well. Over time, peasants developed an ability to rest in fragments. Short bursts of sleep, light sleep, sleep that could be abandoned instantly. This was not healthy, but it was adaptive. Deep sleep was a luxury. Even when staying indoors, many peasants slept lightly. Years of sleeping on roads, in barns, in shared spaces, trained the body to stay alert. True relaxation was rare. Privacy was equally elusive. On the road, bodies were public. Shared floors, shared air, shared sounds, snoring, coughing, murmured prayers. Nothing was hidden. And this shaped medieval attitudes toward personal space. The idea that one might sleep alone, undisturbed, in silence, belonged to another class entirely. For peasants, sleep was social whether they wanted it or not. Illness spread easily in these conditions. Respiratory infections, skin diseases, parasites, lice were almost universal. Fleas, common. Travelers carried these with them, passing them unknowingly from place to place. It was not considered unusual. It was simply part of being human in motion. Children traveling with adults adapted fastest. Their bodies bent more easily to the ground. Their sleep was deeper when it came, but they also absorbed fatigue early, learning that rest was conditional. Many medieval adults remembered their first journeys vividly, not because they were exciting, but because they were uncomfortable in a way that stayed with them. Long after the journey ended, the body remembered the road. Even at home, former travelers often slept near doors, near hearths, on the floor. Beds, when available, were not always trusted. They felt strange, too soft, too exposed. This was not nostalgia, it was habit. The constant negotiation for sleep also shaped social behavior. Peasants learned when to ask and when not to, how to read faces quickly, how to retreat without offense. These skills were as important as walking itself. Refusal was expected. Acceptance was appreciated but not relied upon. Gratitude, when offered, was brief. Lingering created obligation. Obligation created risk. In this way, the road trained emotional restraint. Do not expect kindness. Accept it quietly if it appears. Move on regardless. And yet, despite everything, peasants continued to travel, because staying put could be worse. Bad harvests, rising rents, local disputes, lords who demanded too much. The road offered uncertainty, but it also offered possibility. Somewhere else might be better, or at least different. Sleep then became something deferred, something to be reclaimed later. At home, eventually, but many never reached that point. Some died on the road, quietly, in places that were not theirs. Their bodies discovered in the morning, already part of the landscape. These deaths were noted briefly, if at all. A traveler who died at night was unfortunate, but not shocking. This acceptance of risk speaks volumes. Medieval society expected the poor to endure, to adapt, to disappear if they could not. And the road was one of the tools that enforced this expectation. As we let this part settle, notice how little of this story involves drama. No great tragedies, no heroic suffering, just steady, grinding discomfort, which is often how history actually works. In the next drift of this story, we'll move toward the few rare moments when peasants did find something resembling stability on the road: temporary shelters, seasonal rhythms, and the fragile networks that made long journeys barely possible. Not comfort, just enough. For now, let the road continue, quiet, uneven, and endlessly patient with those who had no choice but to walk it. By the fifth stretch of this long, quiet road, something subtle begins to appear. Not comfort, not safety, but pattern. Because even in a world where poor peasants rarely slept well, rarely slept indoors, and rarely slept without anxiety, humans still tried to create routines. The road was unpredictable, but travelers learned where unpredictability softened just slightly. These places were not havens in the modern sense. They were pauses. Seasonal rhythms mattered more than geography. At certain times of year, the road was fuller. Harvest seasons pulled laborers across regions. Pilgrimage calendars moved people in slow waves. Fairs and market days briefly transformed empty paths into crowded arteries of movement. And where people gathered regularly, some form of shelter followed. Temporary encampments formed along well-used routes, not official ones, not marked on maps, just places everyone seemed to know. A clearing near a river, a bend in the road with good drainage, a stretch of ground that stayed dry even after rain. These were places where peasants expected to find others like themselves. Safety came from numbers, not protection, exactly, just witnesses. A thief was less bold when many eyes were half open. Violence was less likely when retaliation was possible. In these informal camps, sleeping arrangements followed unspoken rules. Newcomers stayed on the edges. Families clustered together. Fires were shared cautiously. Food was guarded, but not aggressively. No one stayed long. Staying long meant attracting attention. Attention from local authorities was rarely helpful. Large groups of poor travelers made officials nervous. They looked like disorder, like potential rebellion, like mouths that would soon demand something. So camps dissolved as quickly as they formed. Another fragile source of stability came from work. Seasonal labor created brief windows where peasants could sleep under a roof again. Harvesting, shearing, construction, road repair. These jobs paid little, but they often included lodging, usually in barns, sheds, or crowded lofts. For travelers, this was rest of a sort. Not because conditions were good, they weren't, but because sleep was expected, allowed, unquestioned, knowing you could lie down without being chased off mattered more than how soft the ground was. Some peasants deliberately timed their journeys to coincide with labor seasons. They followed crops instead of roads. Wheat, then barley, then grapes. The journey became cyclical, predictable. These workers slept in groups, woke early, worked until exhaustion, and collapsed again. The rhythm was brutal, but steady, and steadiness was rare. Children born into these patterns learned the road as a workplace, not a passage. They knew which regions offered work, which lords paid poorly, which barns were locked, which weren't. This knowledge was practical, passed quietly, never written down. There were also religious calendars to consider. Major pilgrim routes like those leading to Canterbury, Rome, or Santiago developed infrastructure over time, not because authorities cared about peasants, but because pilgrims brought money. Even poor pilgrims carried coins, offerings, or labor. Along these routes, shelters were more frequent. Hospices appeared at regular intervals. Churches kept doors open more often. Villagers grew accustomed to strangers passing through. A peasant who attached themselves to a pilgrimage gained access to these networks, even if their faith was flexible. Belief was not always the point. Movement was pilgrimage. Groups offered identity. You were no longer a wandering peasant. You were a pilgrim. That distinction mattered. It changed how you were received, how you were questioned, how long you were tolerated. Badges, tokens, and symbols played a role here. A simple shell, a scrap of cloth, a painted mark. These small signs opened doors that would otherwise remain closed. It was a performance, quietly understood by all involved. And yet, even these routes had limits. During times of plague, famine, or war, hospitality shrank. Fear outweighed piety. Doors closed again. Temporary safety vanished quickly. Weather also dictated rest. Heavy rain forced people into barns and sheds, often with tacit permission. Snow slowed movement, making extended stays unavoidable. In winter, villagers were more likely to allow travelers inside, not out of kindness, but because a frozen corpse outside your village was inconvenient. Summer brought different problems: heat, dehydration, spoilage of food. Sleeping outdoors was easier, but illness spread faster. Insects multiplied. Water sources dried up. Every season traded one discomfort for another. Some peasants developed long-term relationships with certain places, a monastery that tolerated them, a village that needed seasonal help, a particular innkeeper who accepted labor instead of coin. These relationships were fragile. One bad harvest, one accusation, one new official, and they disappeared. There was no contract, no guarantee, just memory and reputation. And reputation was difficult to maintain when you were always moving. It's tempting to imagine these moments of relative stability as hopeful, and in a small way they were. But they did not challenge the system. They existed within it. The medieval world allowed the poor just enough rest to continue being poor, not enough to change their position, not enough to stop traveling, just enough to survive. What's striking is how little complaint survives in the historical record, not because peasants were content, but because their voices were rarely recorded. And when they were, exhaustion doesn't always sound dramatic. It sounds flat, practical, brief. I slept where I could. They let me stay. They did not. These phrases appear again and again in legal records, depositions, and letters. Sleep is mentioned only when it fails completely. Normal suffering leaves little trace. By now, the shape of this story should feel clear. Poor peasants did not journey from inn to inn. They moved between margins, between permissions, between brief pauses and long stretches of endurance. The road offered moments of rest, but never relief. And even when a journey ended, when a peasant finally arrived at a destination, the habits of the road often stayed. Light sleep, early waking, readiness to move again. Because stability, once experienced as temporary, is hard to trust. In the final part of this long drift, we'll step back and look at what all of this meant in the wider medieval world. How these sleeping arrangements shaped ideas of poverty, mobility, and belonging. And how the road quietly reinforced who mattered and who was expected to keep moving. For now, let your thoughts slow. Let the campfires fade. Let the road stretch out one last time. As we settle into the final part of this long drift through medieval travel, it's worth pausing not for drama, but for reflection, not on kings' crowns or conquest, but on the quiet lessons the road taught those who had nothing to claim but their own feet. For poor peasants, travel was education, not formal, not written down, not commemorated in statues or song. It was lived knowledge, absorbed slowly, quietly, almost unconsciously. The road taught endurance, it taught patience, it taught humility. Sleep, or the lack of it, was central. A peasant who survived nights in fields, barns, or church porches learned how fragile comfort was, how conditional warmth was, how easily safety could be withdrawn. And this lesson extended beyond the individual. It shaped social understanding. A traveling peasant knew instinctively how communities responded to outsiders, who could be trusted, who would be indifferent, who might actively refuse assistance. Mobility was not liberating. It was a state of exposure. You were always visible, always negotiable. Belonging was provisional. Village doors, in gates, church porches, they measured your worth as much as your work, your coin, or your reputation. The constant negotiation for sleep and shelter left traces in everyday behavior. People became cautious, economical with words, quick to adapt to expectations, quiet when observation demanded it. Every interaction was a test of discretion. A single misstep could result in a night without cover or worse, suspicion. And yet, there was rhythm, a fragile, temporary rhythm. Seasons, markets, religious calendars, and labor cycles provided a kind of framework. Within these cycles, peasants could anticipate where shelter might appear, where labor could be found, and where meals might be obtained, even if only partially, even if only briefly. The road offered structure. This structure, however, was always conditional. Acceptance in one place might not hold in the next. Hospitality was temporary. Safety was never guaranteed. The medieval world permitted the poor to rest, just enough to continue being poor and traveling. Interestingly, this impermanence shaped community in subtle ways. Peasants traveling in groups shared fire, food, and vigilance. They traded knowledge about roads, inns, fields, and seasonal dangers. Children learned the practicalities of travel from their elders. Women developed strategies to maintain visibility without inviting danger. These networks were not formal, but they existed. They were a social glue built on necessity, caution, and shared hardship. There is a quiet irony here. The roads that made life difficult also connected communities. They created informal networks, passed knowledge, and allowed movement across landscapes otherwise defined by static hierarchies. A peasant moving from village to village might touch dozens of social worlds, each with its own rules, expectations, and temporary courtesies, and all of it pivoted on one simple necessity, the need to lie down. Because travel without sleep is impossible, and the medieval road never guaranteed it. Every hut, barn, porch, or ditch represented not just a place to rest, but a negotiation with society itself. Who could stay? Who must move on? Who belonged? Who did not? By the end of a long journey, these experiences shaped identity. Travel made visible what life at home obscured. It revealed the limits of charity, the subtleties of social rules, and the endurance required merely to survive. And so, the poor peasant's journey was not heroic in the conventional sense. It was quietly human, ordinary, relentless, yet in its ordinariness it contained lessons about the medieval world, about hierarchy, mobility, risk, and the ephemeral nature of comfort. As we drift toward sleep tonight, let us remember these long, quiet nights on the road, nights without warmth, nights without certainty, nights in which every sound, every shadow, demanded attention, nights that, paradoxically, were part of the rhythm of life, because history is often measured in kings and battles, but for the vast majority it was measured in footsteps, in small acts of endurance, in the fragile negotiation of rest, and in the slow, patient unfolding of life along the road. And as we settle under our blankets, somewhere warm and safe, let the thought drift in softly. Once upon a time, sleep itself was a luxury, a negotiation, and a quiet triumph. The road never ended, but the lessons lingered. Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to the world of Tudor England, a place where clothing was not just about covering the body, but about displaying status, allegiance, and sometimes terrible taste. So, dim the lights, settle in, and let your mind wander to a time when roughs could strangle subtly, and fashion dictated survival as much as comfort. Before we begin, if you enjoy these long, quiet strolls through history, gently tap the like button, perhaps subscribe, and then let yourself drift, because the story will carry you whether you're awake or not. Tudor fashion was a strange mix of artistry, authority, and absurdity. Clothing marked social rank, profession, and even political loyalty. For the wealthy, what you wore was almost a declaration of power. For the poor, it was mostly whatever ragged remnants survived the winter, or garments dyed with leftover scraps of color. Let's start with the nobility. Noblemen of the Tudor court were particularly fond of extravagance. They wore doublet-spattered jackets that could make a man look broader, or at least, more imposing. These doublets were often stiffened with horsehair or canvas, and sometimes extended into peplums, flaring over the hips in a way that might make a modern observer wonder about their balance on uneven floors. Sleeves were detachable and interchangeable, allowing a man to mix colors, patterns, and textures according to whim, favor, or the subtle demands of court politics. Stockings were a serious matter. Worn tightly, they displayed wealth, because fine wool or silk was expensive. If you could afford dyed stockings scarlet, violet, or gold, you had succeeded in showing the world that you were significant enough to color your legs, while the rest of society wore gray, brown, or worse. Doublets were accompanied by jerkin-style jackets, sometimes heavily padded, sometimes trimmed with fur. Furs were a critical indicator of status. Sable, marten, erminage, more exclusive than the last. Nobles' garments were stuffed and slashed with contrasting fabrics, revealing glimpses of silk or velvet beneath. It was as if clothing had become a puzzle, a display of wealth encoded in threads, rather than a practical covering for warmth. And then there were the ruffs. The ruff was a stiff, pleated collar that could reach impressive heights. Men's ruffs were often smaller than women's, but even a modest ruff required careful maintenance. They were starched and ironed into perfection, a process that could take hours, and yet, of course, had to be replaced if the wearer breathed too enthusiastically or sneezed. Ruffs were a constant reminder that in Tudor England, elegance often came at the cost of comfort. Now, noble women. Tudor dresses for women were similarly elaborate. The silhouette was tightly structured, fitted bodices, long skirts with padded rolls or bum rolls to widen the hips, and square or rounded shoulders stiffened with layers of fabric. Sleeves could be detachable, embroidered, or lined with contrasting silk. Necklines varied according to fashion, season, and more subtly, marital status. Color was as important as cut. Reds, greens, and blues signaled wealth and taste, but also had political implications. Certain dyes were regulated, and wearing a color above your social station could be a punishable offense. One imagines the subtle panic of a minor courtier who accidentally donned crimson instead of burgundy and had to navigate the queen's watchful eye. Headwear was another domain entirely. Women wore hoods, caps, coifs, and later, French-style conical hats. Hair could be hidden, braided, or adorned with pearls and jewels. Pearls were particularly favored, a symbol of chastity and, of course, expense. Only the wealthiest could afford enough pearls to make an impression, and they often lined them along the front of a bodice or draped them across the hair in loops and strings. Footwear was less ostentatious but no less important. Shoes were made of leather, sometimes pointed, sometimes flat. For nobles, silk coverings could be added. For the poor, leather was reused, patched, and worn thin. Socks or stockings were necessary for warmth and decorum, but they could be threadbare within weeks of heavy use. Jewelry was the finishing touch. Rings, necklaces, bracelets, and brooches punctuated garments with metallic glints, sometimes functional, often purely decorative. These items helped define social standing. Men wore rings on multiple fingers. Women layered chains around necks, clasped with intricate pins. Even small pieces could signal allegiance to a family or political faction. Contrast this with the common folk. Peasants and labourers in Tudor England wore practical clothing. Linen smocks, woolen tunics, and coarse stockings made up the wardrobe. Colours were dull, brown, grey, muted green. Bright dyes were rare, expensive, and reserved for festivals or particularly special occasions. Clothing was mended frequently, patched in ways that often created a quilted or mottled appearance. Shoes were sturdy, functional, and uncomfortable, built for walking the fields or the road, rather than impressing anyone at court. Head coverings were worn by necessity and custom, coifs for women, felt hats or simple hoods for men. Hair was often tied back or tucked, partly for hygiene, partly for safety during labor. And while peasants lacked ruffs, furs, or silk, they sometimes used scraps of color to brighten their garments, a small human insistence on individuality amid hardship. Fabric choices were telling. Linen, wool, and hemp dominated peasant dress, while silks, velvets, and brocades signaled nobility. The ability to maintain these fabrics was another sign of status. Silks stained easily, wool required care, furs needed storage. The nobility could afford servants to wash, repair, and starch garments. The poor could barely manage this with their limited resources. Accessories were a language of their own. Belts, pouches, gloves, and pins completed the outfit. For nobles, they could be intricate and ornate. For commoners, functional and simple. Every addition conveyed meaning, whether it was a sign of wealth, a profession, or compliance with sumptuary laws regulations that dictated what a person could or could not wear, based on their social station. Sumptuary laws were fascinatingly rigid. A man wearing fine cloth he couldn't afford risked punishment. A woman flaunting forbidden jewels might be reprimanded or fined. Clothing regulated identity, behavior, and hierarchy as much as any written law. And yet, some daring souls bent the rules. Peasant tricksters, ambitious merchants, and occasionally, nobles who enjoyed seeing how far the system could be stretched. In all, Tudor fashion was a social language. Every seam, sleeve, and color choice communicated information to those who knew how to read it. It reinforced class, gender, political allegiance, and even moral propriety. Yet beneath the elegance and absurdity lay human bodies contorted, squeezed, and layered under yards of fabric, all to convey status. So as we drift through the streets of Tudor England in our minds, we see men with stiff doublets and perilous ruffs, women with broad skirts and pearl-studded hair, and peasants moving silently through shadowed alleys, their practical clothing blending into the backdrop of daily toil. Fashion was more than clothing. It was survival, identity, and occasionally, a kind of social theater. And as we continue to the next part, we'll explore some of the most outrageous garments, the evolution of ruffs and sleeves, and the small ironic cruelties of Tudor-style clothing that could impress, intimidate, and subtly suffocate all at once. Hey everyone, let's drift a little further into Tudor England, where fashion was as much about spectacle as it was about status, and where common sense often took a quiet back seat to appearance. The world of Tudor dress was elaborate, sometimes ridiculous, and occasionally dangerous. So settle in, let your shoulders relax, and let your mind wander among stiff ruffs, puffed sleeves, and skirts that could double as furniture. As we mentioned, ruffs were a defining feature of Tudor fashion, especially for the elite. These collars were starched into perfect pleats, forming a circular frame around the neck. Some were modest, others enormous, extending several inches beyond the chin. They served no practical purpose, no warmth, no protection, but they declared importance. The irony, of course, is that ruffs required constant maintenance. If a drop of food, a cough, or a sneeze dislodged the starch, the perfect symmetry was ruined. And for those standing too close to a noble, accidental contact could knock the collar askew, a minor social disaster. Men's sleeves were equally theatrical. Sleeves were often detachable, padded, slashed, and puffed. Some men wore paned sleeves, where the outer fabric was cut to reveal a contrasting silk underneath. Imagine trying to perform manual tasks, write letters, or even eat while your arms were encased in layers of stiff fabric. And yet, the more elaborate the sleeve, the more prestige it conferred. Nobles literally wore inconvenience as a badge of honor. For women, skirts could be equally excessive. The padded rolls and bum rolls created a wide silhouette that was impossible to ignore. Walking through narrow doorways required practice. Sitting was a delicate maneuver. Some gowns were so wide that they nearly dictated the movement of anyone around the wearer. Space, like silence, had to yield to fashion. And then there were the decorations. Jewels sewn onto bodices, threads of gold and silver interwoven into sleeves, and pearls stitched along necklines. These embellishments were beautiful, if impractical. Clothing weighed heavily. Fabrics limited movement. Accessories snagged, scratched, and occasionally irritated the skin. And yet, the more burdensome the outfit, the higher the perceived status. Appearance trumped comfort in every sense. Headwear could be another challenge entirely. Women wore French hood-stiff, crescent-shaped headpieces that framed the face and held veils in place. These required pins, padding, and constant adjustment. The larger the hood, the more impossible it became to turn your head naturally. Men's hats, sometimes pointed or wide-brimmed, could obstruct vision, particularly in crowds or at court events. Nobles accepted these inconveniences without complaint, because fashion, after all, was a silent declaration of social power. Colors and fabrics played a similarly strategic role. Velvet, satin, and brocade were luxuries that signaled wealth and influence. Bright dye scarlet, crimson, deep blue were expensive and regulated by sumptuary laws. A man wearing purple without proper rank could face fines or public rebuke. Nobles often used color as a form of political messaging, subtly demonstrating loyalty to factions or families. And some, of course, bent the rules quietly, pushing boundaries just enough to attract attention without inviting punishment. For the lower classes, the contrast was stark. Peasants wore muted tones, coarse wools, and practical garments. Clothing had to withstand work in the fields, repair, and the elements. Patches were common. Bright colors were rare. When peasants did adopt elements of elite fashion, it was usually smaller ribbon, a colored thread, a borrowed style enough to assert individuality without risking penalty. Footwear also reflected the social divide. Nobles wore delicate leather or silk shoes, sometimes pointed beyond practicality. Commoners wore sturdy, durable shoes that were often patched repeatedly. Some poor travelers went barefoot in warm months, not out of style, but necessity. Shoes could be lost, damaged, or stolen. Wealthy shoes could hardly withstand the same conditions at all. But nobles were rarely walking across muddy fields, so practicality mattered little. One amusing feature of Tudor fashion was the codpiece, a padded pouch worn by men to accentuate the groin. Initially practical, it became increasingly elaborate, sometimes protruding unnaturally and decorated with embroidery or jewels. It was a statement piece that communicated virility and social power. Practicality, almost entirely gone. Safety, not considered. Social effect, paramount. Underneath all these layers, comfort was secondary. Linen undergarments absorbed sweat, but did little else. Corsetry and padding for women created a rigid silhouette, often restricting movement and circulation. Layers of silk, velvet, and fur created warmth in winter, but sweltering heat in summer. Every garment was simultaneously a signal and a challenge, a triumph of appearance over bodily ease. The absurdities of Tudor style extended even to etiquette. Walking, sitting, or performing simple tasks required training. A woman with a large skirt or stiff bodice learned to tilt, balance, and step carefully. A man with a massive ruff practiced measured movements so as not to disturb his collar or his neighbor. Fashion dictated behavior almost as much as it dictated appearance. In short, Tudor dress was as much a social experiment as a clothing choice. It tested endurance, patience, and attention. It communicated status, allegiance, and sometimes subtle messages of power or rivalry. And, naturally, it often made life more uncomfortable than it needed to be because, in Tudor England, the more extreme the appearance, the more impressive it was considered. As we drift toward the next part, we'll explore the evolution of Tudor fashion over decades, the influence of foreign styles, and the subtle, often ironic interplay between practicality and extravagance in a society obsessed with visual display. As we drift further into Tudor England, it becomes clear that clothing was never static. Fashion changed with every reign, every foreign marriage, and every courtly whim. So let's settle into the soft glow of candlelight and explore how Tudor fashion evolved over decades, influenced by politics, travel, and the ever-watchful eyes of the court. Henry VII, the founder of the Tudor dynasty, favored rich, restrained colors and heavy fabrics that emphasized wealth and authority. His court preferred dark, luxurious velvets and furs, layered in ways that suggested power without overt flamboyance. Men wore long gowns over doublets, wide sleeves sometimes lined with fur, and hats that tilted just enough to suggest taste. Women of his court followed similar principles: long, heavy gowns, understated embroidery, and the beginnings of the French hood style, a slightly curved headdress that framed the face and contained a veil. By the time Henry VIII ascended the throne, fashion had shifted toward display and spectacle. Henry VIII was famously indulgent, surrounding himself with fabrics, jewels, and splendor that communicated absolute authority. He required the same attention from his courtiers. Men's sleeves became puffed and slashed to show contrasting silks beneath. Ruffs started to grow in size and intricacy. Hose were brightly colored. The king's influence dictated that no nobleman could appear plain without risking social scorn. Foreign influence played a significant role in Tudor style. The marriage of Catherine of Aragon brought Spanish fashions, with structured bodices, stiffly lined skirts, and elaborate headpieces. The Spanish influence emphasized modesty and authority, yet also introduced intricate embroidery and lavish use of fabrics. Anne Boleyn and later wives introduced French trends, particularly the French hood and sleeker, more youthful silhouettes. Each queen subtly reshaped women's dress at court, creating a kind of visual dialogue between politics, culture, and aesthetics. The evolution of men's fashion was equally dynamic. Codpieces grew in size and decoration, hose became brighter, and doublets were padded to create broad shoulders or exaggerated torsos. Accessories like gloves, jeweled belts, and swords were not merely decorative, they were carefully chosen signals of allegiance and wealth. Even small details mattered. A color in a hat, a trim on a sleeve, or the way a ruff was folded could communicate loyalty or ambition. Sumptuary laws tried to regulate these excesses. The crown dictated which colors, fabrics, and trims could be worn according to rank, yet nobles found ways around these restrictions. They mixed materials, layered fabrics, or exaggerated elements, just enough to convey wealth without overtly breaking the law. Fashion became a subtle rebellion, a visual language of social maneuvering. For women, silhouette continued to be paramount. Stezerly corsets were worn to shape the torso and support heavy skirts. Skirts were widened with bum rolls or padding, creating the distinct Tudor silhouette. Necklines varied according to season, rank, and occasion, while sleeves were detachable and interchangeable, often featuring slashes or embroidery to reveal fine fabrics underneath. The French hood remained dominant, but variations in shape and decoration allowed women to display individuality without challenging courtly norms. Children's clothing reflected miniature versions of adult styles, though simpler. Boys wore doublets and hose. Girls wore bodices and skirts, often trimmed to suggest the family's wealth. Clothing educated children in social hierarchy from a very young age, a visual initiation into courtly or noble life. Even the common people were subtly affected by courtly trends. While peasants could not afford velvets or furs, they sometimes imitated colors, sleeve shapes, or hat styles with scraps of fabric. Fashion trickled down slowly, filtered by practicality and economic reality. These small adaptations allowed individuals to participate in visual culture, even if in muted form. Footwear also evolved. Nobles wore soft leather shoes, often pointed or square-toed, embroidered or layered with fabric. Peasants and artisans continued to rely on sturdier shoes, suitable for work and travel, sometimes patched repeatedly. Gloves, hats, and small accessories allowed subtle distinction without extensive expense. Jewelry remained a critical aspect of both male and female fashion. Men wore rings, chains, and ornate sword hilts. Women wore necklaces, earrings, and brooches. Pearls were particularly favored, symbolizing purity and status. For nobles, jewelry completed the outfit in the same way that color, fabric, and silhouette communicated social position. What emerges from all of this is a deeply interconnected system. Fashion was not random. It was carefully codified, yet flexible. It signaled identity, authority, allegiance, and sometimes rebellion. The evolution of Tudor dress reflected a society obsessed with hierarchy, visual communication, and, of course, style. As we drift onward, in the next part, we'll explore daily dress practices, undergarments, and the small rituals of dressing, how the Tudors spent hours preparing to meet the day, the court, or a dinner, and how every choice reinforced their place in the complex social hierarchy. As we drift into the final part of our Tudor fashion journey, it's time to explore the quieter, more intimate side of clothing, the layers beneath the layers, the daily routines, and the rituals that structured life around dress. These details reveal not just style, but the rhythms of a society obsessed with appearance, hierarchy, and subtle social messaging. Daily life in Tudor England was an exercise in preparation. For the nobility, mornings began with attendants, maids, and valets who helped layer garments meticulously. A noblewoman's day could start with stays, a stiffened bodice designed to shape the torso, followed by a chemise, a petticoat, the outer gown, and finally, a veil or French hood. Each layer was carefully adjusted to maintain the desired silhouette. Pins and laces held fabrics in place. Belts and sashes secured skirts. A single misplaced fold could throw off the entire effect. Men followed similar rituals. Linen shirts were worn beneath doublets and jerkin-style jackets, with hose stretched to the thigh or knee. Codpieces were fitted and often padded to create a deliberate exaggeration. Sleeves, detachable and carefully arranged, completed the ensemble. Hats, gloves, and accessories were added only after the main garments were in place, each with symbolic as well as practical meaning. Undergarments were functional but restrictive. Stays and corsets shaped the body. Chemises absorbed sweat and protected expensive fabrics. Layering provided warmth, but also made movement cumbersome. A noblewoman bending to pick up an object or a man reaching to shake a hand had to navigate the constraints of his clothing. Fashion dictated posture, behavior, and even social interaction. Jewelry was incorporated into daily wear. Pearls, rings, brooches, and chains were not optional. They were expected. They completed the visual hierarchy, and 4 courtly gatherings indicated the wearer's rank and alliances. Men's jewelry was more subtle, but chains, rings, and jeweled sword hilts communicated wealth and political alignment. Even small gestures were choreographed by clothing. The angle at which a ruff was tilted, the way a sleeve was puffed, or the placement of a glove could signal intention, allegiance, or status. Fashion and etiquette were inseparable. To dress well was to participate in social theater, to perform your identity for observers who understood the language of textiles. For the common people, the process was quieter but no less significant. Peasants' clothing was simpler, but care and repair mattered. Smocks, tunics, and woolen stockings were patched, mended, and preserved. Clothing had to endure work, travel, and the elements. Even small acts mending a tear, washing a garment, or adjusting a hood were rituals of survival, practical yet meaningful. Season dictated variations. Summer demanded lighter fabrics. Winter required layering for warmth. Rain or mud necessitated sturdy shoes and protective cloaks. Head coverings were worn year-round, partly for hygiene, partly for social convention. These daily considerations were not trivial. They were essential for maintaining comfort, functionality, and social acceptability. Social gatherings amplified the importance of dress. Banquets, court sessions, and festivals required full display. Nobles spent hours preparing, ensuring every garment was perfectly arranged, every accessory correctly positioned. Missteps could be socially costly. Even minor wrinkles or misplaced ruffles could invite subtle censure. Appearance was a silent language, understood and judged by all who observed it. Clothing also reinforced gender roles. Women's dress emphasized the torso, hips, and neckline, reinforcing ideals of femininity and status. Men's clothing highlighted breadth, power, and authority. while also displaying wealth through fabrics and ornamentation. Both sexes performed identity through attire, and failure to adhere to conventions could be interpreted as impropriety or disrespect. Interestingly, children's clothing mirrored adults, albeit simplified. Boys wore miniature doublets and hose. Girls wore bodices and skirts, often trimmed to indicate family status. This early training in dress was part of social education, teaching children about hierarchy, propriety, and the subtle art of visual communication. The overall effect of Tudor dress was cumulative. Layers, accessories, colors, and fabrics worked together to create a body transformed into a symbol. Clothing was not merely covering, it was display, ritual, and sometimes subtle power. It could impress, intimidate, and even discomfort, all in service of social order. And yet, for all its rigid structure, Tudor fashion also allowed for personal expression. Sleeves, ruffs, and jewelry could be customized, arranged, and adjusted. Nobles experimented with colors, fabrics, and patterns to signal loyalty, individuality, or political ambition. Even small choices could carry meaning in a courtly environment where visual cues mattered more than spoken words. So as we drift to the close of this exploration, we see that Tudor fashion was far more than clothing. It was endurance, performance, hierarchy, and social negotiation. It shaped movement, behavior, and identity, leaving lasting impressions not only on observers but on the wearers themselves. The daily ritual of dressing, the management of fabrics and accessories, and the subtle choreography of posture and movement all contributed to a world in which appearance was both armor and announcement. And now, as we rest our imaginations, imagine the soft rustle of silk and velvet, the faint scent of beeswax and starch, the quiet clinking of rings and chains, reminders that in Tudor England fashion was live performance and subtle power, all wrapped into garments that could charm, intimidate, and quietly dictate the rhythm of every day. Hey everyone, tonight, let's drift back to the Middle Ages and wander slowly through the bustling Arab bazaars, a world alive with color, scent, and the gentle hum of human commerce. Settle into your chair, dim the lights, and let the smells of spices, incense, and sun-baked earth fill your imagination. The Arab bazaar, or souk, was not merely a marketplace, it was a stage on which society performed itself. Merchants, customers, laborers, and travelers all moved in delicate patterns, negotiating space, goods, and social standing. Every stall, every woven rug, every brass lamp was a piece of a complex, living puzzle. Spices were the true stars. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and pepper were displayed openly, their scents mingling in the dry heat. For a European traveler, these smells could be almost overwhelming, intoxicating in a way that suggested magic, wealth, and distant lands. But for the locals, it was just everyday commerce, mundane magic that accompanied the rhythms of life. Silks and textiles were draped in layers, hanging from wooden frames or stacked in folded piles. Colors were deep, rich, and often dyed with natural pigments sourced from distant regions. Indigo, saffron yellow, and deep crimson reflected both artistic taste and status. Fabrics were a form of currency. A well-dyed piece could signal wealth, taste, or political allegiance. Jewelry sparkled in small trays or glass cases. Gold and silver coins, gemstones, and pearls caught the light in ways designed to draw the eye. Merchants often wore some of their wares themselves: bracelets on the wrist, rings on fingers, chains draped across the chest, displaying confidence and subtly advertising their trade. Food stalls added another layer. Dates, figs, nuts, and dried fruits were piled high. Bread was baked nearby, often still warm, and olives glistened with oil, inviting the passerby to sample. Tea and coffee, though in their early forms, offered a fragrant counterpoint to the heavy spices. The aroma of roasting meat or simmering stews occasionally mingled, hinting at the life beyond the market. Noise and rhythm were part of the experience. Merchants called out prices, each voice slightly melodic, trained to carry over the chatter. Bargaining was expected, a dance of subtle gestures, polite refusal, and strategic concession. Children ran between stalls, learning the patterns of commerce as naturally as they learned their prayers. Animals, donkeys and camels, threaded through narrow paths, carrying goods or resting near the edges, adding a low, constant hum to the atmosphere. Every stall told a story. Carpets from Persia, spices from India, glassware from Egypt, dyes from Syria. The bazaar was both local and cosmopolitan, connecting towns, cities, and empires in a subtle web of exchange. And yet, despite the spectacle, life in the bazaar was quiet in its rhythms. People moved at measured paces, gestures repeated daily, eyes scanning for familiarity and opportunity. Security was informal but present. Local guards, dogs, and the natural watchfulness of merchants maintained order. Theft was discouraged, not only by force but by the social networks embedded in the market. Insults or disputes were mediated by custom and negotiation rather than law. Everyone understood their place, and the flow of the bazaar relied on that understanding. In this space, wealth was both visible and fleeting. A merchant could display riches one day and carry little by nightfall. Travelers moved cautiously, aware that the charms of the bazaar could be seductive, but also risky. Bargains were balanced by caution, curiosity tempered by experience. By the end of the day, the bazaar slowed. The colors dimmed under the evening sun. Merchants packed their wares carefully. Animals were led away, and the quiet hum replaced the morning clamor. The scent of spices lingered in the air, mixing with dust and the faint smoke of hearths. The bazaar was alive even in rest, holding secrets of commerce, culture, and human endurance until the next day. And in the next part we'll drift into the lives of the people who made these markets pulse. The merchants, the artisans, the wanderers, and the travelers whose presence gave the bazaar meaning, creating a subtle web of economy, culture, and social connection that extended far beyond its winding streets. And now, let's drift deeper into the Arab bazaar, into the lives of the people whose movements, conversations, and quiet routines made it a living, breathing world. The air is softer now, evening settling in, and the market's rhythms slow. Yet life within it continues, gentle and persistent. Merchants were the heartbeat of the bazaar. Some owned stalls, small wooden constructions draped with colorful textiles, while others moved with their goods, carrying them from street to street. Each merchant knew the value of patience. Negotiation was an art form, not a rush. A calm voice, a measured bow, or a slight smile could secure a sale. Sometimes deals were not about money at all, but about favor, alliance, or reputation. Artisans worked quietly nearby, crafting the objects that adorned the stalls. Glassblowers, metalworkers, weavers, and potters each had their own rhythms. The hiss of a kiln, the soft tapping of a hammer, the gentle friction of a loom underscored the slow hum of the bazaar. These sounds were unremarkable to locals, yet mesmerizing to outsiders, each note part of the subtle music of daily life. Travelers passed through constantly, bringing news, stories, and exotic goods from distant lands. They were often weary, moving slowly with packs or riding animals, yet the bazaar offered a temporary home, a place to rest, trade, and observe. For them, the market was a microcosm of a wider world. Languages intertwined, coins changed hands, and scents of spices, herbs, and baked goods mingled with the dust of travel. Children added another layer of life. They darted between legs, mimicking the gestures of adults, carrying messages or small items, learning early the art of negotiation and social navigation. Their laughter, soft and fleeting, reminded the market that it was not merely a place of commerce, but a space of human connection. Food stalls continued to provide sustenance and subtle entertainment. Dates, figs, and nuts were offered freely at times, tokens of generosity or strategy. Warm bread and simmering stews filled the air with comfort, while teas and early coffee brewed patiently, signaling the approach of modern tastes. The smells were calming, drawing both locals and travelers into the rhythm of daily exchange. Social networks were woven delicately. Merchants knew their regular customers. Artisans anticipated demand. Travelers exchanged information. Gossip circulated quietly, rumors traveling from stall to stall, a subtle web of connection. Trust was both currency and shield. A merchant who betrayed confidence could lose far more than gold. Reputation could vanish overnight, leaving him vulnerable in a world where law was secondary to social bonds. Even the less obvious participants contributed. Animals carried goods and supported movement. Servants, apprentices, and helpers moved silently, unseen yet essential. The bazaar was a choreography of small acts, repeated daily, maintaining the continuity of commerce, society, and culture. As night approached, lamps were lit, oil flickered in brass holders, casting warm glows on textiles, metals, and faces. Shadows danced across walls and streets, softening the harsh lines of trade and commerce. The pace slowed, conversations softened, and the hum became gentle. The bazaar, ever present, embraced the quiet, readying itself to awaken again with the morning sun. Through all this, one subtle truth emerges. The Arab bazaar was more than a marketplace. It was a social organism, a place where economy, culture, and human endurance intersected. It taught patience, observation, and adaptability. It required negotiation, vigilance, and subtlety. And above all, it demonstrated the quiet beauty of daily life, of small rhythms, and of people persisting together in a complex, interconnected world. So as we drift to the close of this final part, let the soft sounds of imagined bells, whispered negotiations, and distant laughter linger in your mind. The Arab bazaar, even in memory, is alive not in dramatic events, but in the steady, quiet persistence of human life.